My name is Lynette Margolis. I am 72 years old, and my life, for as long as I remember, has been measured in teaspoons and simmered on stovetops. There are women who paint, women who keep diaries, women who run marathons, women who lead congregations. I have cooked. If you ask me for my life story, I will recite the recipe for apricot jam, the one with the lemon zest and just enough sugar that the sunlight is trapped in each jar. My husband Gerald loved it on thick slices of bread when he came home from the hardware store, cheeks pink from the cold. My children, Emily and Dan, each had their own favorite casseroles. Emily, the one with sweet potatoes and sage. Dan, the old-fashioned chicken pot pie, always with extra crust pinched around the edges just for him. When they were small, my kitchen was always noisy. Laughter, squabbles, thudding feet, music from a battered radio, the shush of the oven door. I cooked for birthday parties, school bake sales, for Sunday afternoons when the air in the house seemed heavy and needed to be lightened with the smell of cinnamon. Even after Gerald died, 7 years ago, quietly, with the same gentle dignity with which he'd lived, I kept the rhythm. It was not a duty. It was my offering, my way of touching their lives from across the miles and the years. Even when they moved out, married, had families of their own, they would come back on weekends, and the first question was always, "What's for dinner, Mom?" I was happy to oblige. There were, of course, quiet afternoons when the house felt too still, and I would find myself making soup just in case. Just in case someone dropped by, just in case one of the grandchildren had a cough, just in case the doorbell rang and it was someone in need of warmth or comfort or something familiar. My kitchen was my heart's geography, the shelves lined with recipe cards written in my mother's hand, the battered Dutch oven, the one my sister gave me as a wedding gift, the chipped mugs collected from church bazaars, the ticking of the clock above the window, marking the hours I poured myself into flour, into dough, into love made visible. Evenings were a ritual. I would put on my old cardigan, pour myself a cup of tea, and sit at the kitchen table, surrounded by the scent of whatever I'd just made. Apple cake, borscht, roast chicken. I would write little notes to tuck into lunch bags, or wrap up a loaf of bread to leave on a neighbor's doorstep. My hands were rarely still. If you had asked me if I was happy, I would have said yes. If you had asked me if I was needed, I would have said yes with all my heart. It never occurred to me that one day my cooking would be met with silence, that the gifts I poured into every simmering pot and crimped pie would be set aside for something more convenient, that the heart I had always served on the table might no longer be what was wanted, or perhaps never quite what was needed. But that, I suppose, is another story. For now, I am Lynette. I am a mother, a grandmother, a widow. I am a woman who feeds, who needs, who stirs, who gives. This is where my story begins. It was a Thursday in early March when the weather could not make up its mind, sunlight glancing off icy patches in the street, then sudden squalls of wind that rattled the windows and sent the sparrows tumbling across the yard. The old radiators hissed and clanked, and Lynette, wrapped in her blue house sweater, set about preparing her kitchen for the afternoon. She had always liked Thursdays, a day with no particular claims on her time, when she could cook for pleasure rather than necessity. She hummed softly, moving between the pantry and the kitchen table. Her fingers worked automatically, washing carrots, dicing onions, measuring flour, rolling dough into neat rounds for pies. Today, she was making her husband's favorite stew, just because she missed him a little more than usual. She also made extra. There was always someone to feed, even if it was just a neighbor or a friend from church who stopped by for tea. By early afternoon, the house was filled with the fragrance of simmering broth, mingled with cinnamon from an apple cake cooling on the rack. Lynette placed jars of her homemade raspberry jam on the counter, intending to send them home with Emily for the grandchildren. She wiped her hands, checked her reflection in the hall mirror, and felt a tiny spark of anticipation. Visits from her family were rarer these days, but she still set the table with the good linen and the blue willow china, as if to coax the old warmth back. When the doorbell rang, she startled a little. She was always expecting, always hoping. Emily and Dan came together, her daughter in a green coat, her son lugging a bag of groceries, more out of habit than need. The grandchildren stayed home this time, caught up with school and soccer and the tangle of teenage life. They chatted at the doorway, exchanging small pleasantries. "How are you? Isn't the wind awful? Did you see the neighbor's daffodils?" Inside, Lynette took their coats, ushered them into the kitchen, and offered them tea. She tried to ignore the way their eyes flickered over the countertop, at the trays of food, at the careful arrangements of spoons and napkins. They accepted tea but left the jam untouched. Emily checked her phone twice during the first 10 minutes. Dan glanced at the oven as if measuring time. The conversation felt thinner than usual, punctuated by sips of tea and the ticking of the kitchen clock. Lynette tried to draw them out. "I made the stew Gerald loved. Remember how he used to sneak a taste before it was ready? I saved the end pieces of the bread for you, Dan, and the children's favorite biscuits for when you visit." Emily smiled. "It smells wonderful, Mom. But actually—" She paused, glancing at her brother. Dan cleared his throat, and Lynette saw, for the first time, something rehearsed flicker between them. Emily's smile was gentle, almost apologetic. "Mom, we've arranged for food delivery for you. Healthy meals. They'll come every few days, right to your door. You don't need to cook anymore. Just heat them up and eat. It's easy." Dan nodded, his tone too bright. "We feel safer that way, Mom. With you living alone, we know you'll eat something good, and you won't have to fuss with pots and pans, or—" He let the sentence trail off. For a moment, Lynette stood perfectly still, her hand hovering above the stack of soup cans she had just arranged for them to take home. The air seemed to thin around her, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly loud, the scent of cinnamon cloying. She set down the ladle and folded her hands. "Thank you," she said quietly, looking from one to the other. "That's very convenient." The rest of the visit passed in a kind of soft blur. Emily showed her how to use the meal delivery app. Dan tested the front door lock, as if to remind himself he was still useful. They left the groceries on the counter and did not take the soup or the jam. After the door closed behind them, Lynette stood for a long time in the quiet kitchen. She listened to the wind as it pressed against the window pane, watched dust motes swirl in a shaft of sunlight across the tablecloth. Her hands itched to busy themselves, but there was nothing left to do. The bread cooled untouched. The apple cake waited in vain for plates to be set. In the silence, she wondered when care had become inconvenience, when the comfort she offered had become something to be managed, scheduled, and boxed away. She tried to feel anger or even sorrow, but mostly she just felt empty, as if the room itself had exhaled and forgotten her name. When the dusk fell, she covered the soup and placed it in the freezer. She wiped the crumbs from the table. She made herself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen window, watching as the street lights flickered on, one by one, in the growing twilight. She felt both lighter and older than she had in years. She slept that night with the faintest ache in her chest, a silence she could taste, like the absence of salt in a loaf of bread. For days after her children's visit, Lynette moved through the house in a hush, as if the rooms themselves were holding their breath. She noticed things she had long ignored: a chipped tile near the stove, the faded rug by the pantry, the echoing tick of the wall clock. There were no voices, no laughter trailing up the hallway, No requests for, "Just one more cookie, please, Grandma." There was only the gentle hum of the refrigerator, the steady sigh of the old furnace, and the memory of hands reaching for plates that never left the cupboard. In the mornings, she still woke before dawn. Habit, she supposed, or maybe hope. She would wrap herself in her cardigan and descend the stairs, each footstep muffled in the stillness. Her hands reached automatically for the flour, the yeast, the eggs lined up like a silent choir. She kneaded dough, letting her mind wander. To the first time she baked bread for Gerald in their tiny apartment, to the birthday cakes with too much frosting and the laughter that came afterward, to the scent of roast chicken drifting up the stairs, drawing children to the table like moths to a lamp. But when the timer chimed and the loaves emerged golden and fragrant from the oven, there was no one to tear them open, to slather on butter while the crust still steamed. The bread sat on the counter, cooling in the sun, its promise unclaimed. Lynette realized she was making food not for anyone's hunger, but for the muscle memory of caring. On the third day, she found herself with too much. The freezer was full, trays of soup, jars of jam, cakes wrapped in wax paper, casseroles in foil. She opened the door and surveyed the neat stacks of containers, all labeled in her careful script: chicken stew, carrot cake, potato gratin, lentil soup, berry compote. She had packed up her history in boxes, waiting for someone to want it. She closed the freezer door and leaned against it, the cold seeping through her cardigan. For the first time, she asked herself, "What am I saving this for?" Her answer came from the deep quiet that filled the house. She thought of the shelter at St. Agatha's, the church down the street, where every Tuesday and Friday volunteers gathered to serve hot meals to anyone who needed them. She remembered Mrs. Kearney, who had lost her husband last winter and whose son rarely called. Mr. Halverson, who shuffled in with his coat too thin and eyes too bright. The tired young women, the families. The men who always thanked her as if she were giving them something sacred. That afternoon, Lynette stacked her containers in a cardboard box, layered them with dish towels for insulation. She put on her best coat, the navy one Gerald had always liked, and tied a scarf around her neck. The wind bit at her cheeks as she made her way down the block, the box of food cradled in her arms like a child. The walk felt both strange and familiar, a purpose long dormant, revived by something other than routine. The church hall was warm, bustling with voices and the rattle of pans. When she arrived, she was greeted by a chorus of, "Hello, Mrs. Margoli." The volunteers took her box with gratitude, exclaiming over the smell of her pies, the neat labels, the way her food seemed to carry a little bit of home into the cold. One of the women, Rita, pressed Lynette's hands between her own. "You don't realize how much comfort you've just brought, Lynette. She gestured at the casseroles, the cakes, the jam. This is more than food. It's hope. It's proof someone remembers them." Lynette felt her throat tighten with a sudden, gentle pride. No one asked her to download an app or made her feel small for fussing with old-fashioned recipes. Here, her care was not inconvenient, not something to be managed or replaced, but a lifeline, a small miracle delivered in foil and glass. She stayed to help serve. She listened as stories unfolded around the long tables, losses, small victories, memories that tasted of better days. She ladled soup, poured coffee, wiped down trays, and laughed at jokes she'd heard 100 times. She watched the lines soften from faces as her bread was passed around, watched children scrape the last crumbs from their plates. Walking home in the evening, Lynette felt lighter than she had in weeks. Her steps were brisk. The cold air tingled with a sense of beginning. At her front door, she paused and looked back at the darkness settling over the street. She thought of the boxes in her freezer, now empty, and her heart filled with something like peace. That night, she slept soundly. In her dreams, her kitchen was full, not just of family, but of strangers and neighbors, and the comfort of being wanted, of being necessary, not just convenient. When she woke at dawn, she found herself humming again, the silence in her home less heavy, touched now by a gentle possibility. Spring crept into the neighborhood as quietly as Lynette's new habits. The first hints of green poked through the frost-bitten grass outside her window. Every morning, sunlight slanted across her kitchen table and illuminated a scattering of crumbs, evidence that, for the first time in months, Lynette had started eating breakfast without hurry, savoring the simple taste of her own bread. The rhythm of her days changed. She no longer baked with the mechanical purpose of filling a freezer for her children. Instead, she woke with ideas. What if she tried Mrs. Halverson's potato rolls or the lemon sponge cake from her own girlhood in Iowa? Lynette dug through old recipe boxes, notebooks with curling edges, scraps of newspaper clipped decades ago. Her kitchen filled not with the ache of memory, but with possibility. After her first visit to the shelter, Rita had pulled her aside with a grin. "You know, Lynette, I heard you made pie crust like nobody else. Why don't you teach some of us?" The invitation had felt almost subversive. Wasn't she too old, too set in her ways? But Lynette said yes. A week later, she found herself in the basement kitchen of St. Agatha's, standing before a group of women, some with gray hair and soft halos, some with streaks of white defiant against black. They wore flour-dusted aprons and hopeful, uncertain expressions. There was Martha, who had always feared baking. "I can't even boil water." And Sandra, whose arthritis made her fingers stubborn, but whose jokes made everyone laugh. The first session was awkward, clumsy laughter, butter scattered on the floor, too much salt in the dough. But as the hours passed, hands grew steadier, voices less tentative. Lynette showed them how to read dough by touch, how to coax flavor from what seemed like nothing, how a pie crust could be patched and still turn out golden. "Recipes are only half the story," she said, dusting her hands on her apron. "The rest is what you bring to the table, memories, mistakes, love, even sorrow. That's what makes it yours." Word spread, first through the shelter, then to the church, and then to the little library 2 blocks away. The librarian, a young woman with nervous eyes and an enthusiasm for community projects, approached Lynette after a Sunday service. "Would you ever consider leading a group here? We could call it something. Maybe Flavors of Memory Club?" Lynette hesitated, but the idea tugged at her. She had always been shy about claiming space outside her kitchen, but now the world seemed to be opening a door. The first club meeting was tentative. 5 women showed up, clutching handwritten recipes, stories trembling behind their eyes. They baked together, trading tips and laughter. At the end, everyone wrapped up something to take home. The smell of cinnamon and warm pastry drifted through the stacks of books, mingling with the papery hush. By the third week, the group had doubled in size. Women brought their daughters, granddaughters, sometimes even their husbands, eager to learn the secrets of a perfect scone or a chicken pot pie. The library transformed. Flour on the carpet, laughter echoing through the reading room, aprons hung next to backpacks on the coat hooks. One rainy afternoon, a reporter from the local newspaper stopped by, drawn by rumors of the women who cooked time. She sat at the table, notebook open, and asked Lynette, "Why do you think so many people want to join?" Lynette thought for a moment before replying, "Maybe because what we're making isn't just food. It's something you can't get in a box. Comfort, memory, a little piece of ourselves." The article ran the next Sunday, a small photo of Lynette at the head of the table, rolling out dough with the youngest member of the group, an 11-year-old named Daisy, whose mother worked nights at the hospital. The phone at the library rang off the hook. A week later, a producer from the local radio station called, asking if Lynette might share her pie recipe on the air. The morning of the interview, Lynette sat at her kitchen table, a warm pie cooling in front of her, and spoke into the phone with a nervous smile. The secret, she said, is to never be afraid of making a mess. You'll always find your way back to something sweet. She hung up the phone and sat quietly, hands folded in her lap, the aroma of baked apples drifting through the room. For the first time in a long while, she did not feel invisible or unnecessary. She felt instead woven into something new, something living, rising, bright. Her kitchen, once a place of longing, had become a place of gathering again, not for those who demanded her care by habit, but for those who chose to share it. And Lynette quietly found herself tasting joy. Easter came late that year, tiptoeing in behind gray, reluctant clouds and the uncertain crocuses poking through the mud in Lynette's front yard. Holidays used to be a kind of joyful, exhausting chaos, her house filled with the clang of pots and pans, grandchildren's laughter, the kitchen radio tuned to a station that played hymns in the morning and oldies in the afternoon. There had always been too many coats for the hooks by the door, too many voices clamoring for just a taste, too many shoes kicked off in the hallway. But this year, the house was quiet. On Good Friday, Lynette polished the dining table, just as she always had. But for the first time in her life, she didn't set it for guests. She ran her fingers over the wood surface, tracing faint rings left by mugs and bowls from years past. She remembered every hand that had reached across this table, her husband's, her children's, even her own mother's, hands that never shook until the very end. On Saturday, she attended the Morning Flavors of Memory Club at the library. There, she found herself folding napkins into rabbits for a group of women and their grandkids. Daisy, the 11-year-old, brought in a clutch of bright eggs, and Lynette showed her how to gently marble them using onion skins and vinegar, a trick passed down from her Polish grandmother. There was laughter, flour in the air, and a pot of strong tea brewing in the back room. At the end, Lynette sliced her famous apple pear pie, each piece topped with a dollop of cream, and watched as her new friends closed their eyes in delight. "This is better than anything from a store," someone sighed. "It's better because it's made with you," another said softly, and Lynette's heart swelled. Sunday dawned with a thin mist and a phone call from Emily. "Happy Easter, Mom," her daughter chirped, her voice cheerful but somehow fragile around the edges. "Happy Easter, dear," Lynette replied, balancing the receiver on her shoulder as she stirred a pot of soup for the afternoon meal at the shelter. There was a pause. "So, what are you up to today?" "Oh, I'm volunteering at St. Agatha's. Then I have a bit of club paperwork to finish." Emily hesitated. "You're not baking anything today? No honey rolls or that chocolate almond cake Dad used to love?" Lynette smiled. She could picture her daughter standing in her bright kitchen, eyeing a neat stack of plastic containers labeled Holiday Special from the food delivery service. "No, dear," she replied gently. "I'm signed up to deliver care these days. You are too, aren't you? Eat what you choose." She heard a laugh, a little forced, brittle around the edges. "Right, of course, Mom. The kids asked about your cake, that's all. But it's good what they deliver. It's healthy." "I'm glad," Lynette said, and truly she was. She meant it. She wanted her daughter to have what she needed, even if it wasn't what Lynette had always given. After they hung up, Lynette washed her hands and tucked the phone away. She felt a tiny ache, but it was not the old wound of being overlooked. It was something lighter, more like nostalgia than pain. That afternoon at the shelter, she ladled soup into bowls, sprinkled chives over new potatoes, and listened to the stories of those around her. There was a man who told her about Easter Sundays in Georgia, a woman who remembered her grandmother's angel food cake, a child who simply smiled and asked for a second helping. In their words, Lynette recognized a hunger that was not just for food, but for memory, for care, for the kind of presence that lingers long after the plates are cleared. The Flavors of Memory Club met again on Tuesday. The group had grown. Now there were men as well as women, young mothers with babies in tow, retirees who brought bread from their own ovens, people who had seen her face in the newspaper and wanted to know, what makes your pastry so light, Lynette? They traded not just recipes, but stories, loss, hope, laughter, ways of holding on to those they loved. The library had to open the multi-purpose room to accommodate them all. Meanwhile, in Emily's house, the holiday came and went with a peculiar stillness. She and Dan texted back and forth. Did Mom call you? Yeah, she said she's busy. You get her pie? No, but the food delivery sent some carrot cake. It's okay, I guess. That night, after her own children went to bed, Emily sat at the kitchen table, looking at the untouched containers in the fridge. She realized the silence was different now. It wasn't the hush of contentment after a good meal, but something colder, emptier, a silence that settled not just in the house, but somewhere inside her. Lynette, meanwhile, found herself surrounded not by absence, but by a quiet abundance. She realized gently and almost with surprise that she was no longer waiting for her family to claim her care. She was no longer baking just for old memories or hopes that someone might come knocking. She was part of something growing, and the warmth she once tried to offer in her kitchen had spilled into the world, finding new hands and hearts. And for the first time in years, when she returned home that night, the empty house didn't feel lonely. It felt full of possibility. May was a month of tender beginnings, apple trees blushing into blossom along Lynette's street, sun pouring in through her kitchen window in the late afternoons. The familiar ache that used to settle in her chest each spring, the one that asked, "Will anyone need me this year?" had softened. Instead, Lynette found herself busy, not with waiting, but with planning. She collected new recipes, kept a notebook filled with ideas for the Flavors of Memory Club, and returned home most evenings with flour on her cuffs and the echo of other people's stories in her mind. Her children, meanwhile, felt the shifting current, though at first they did not know its source. In Emily's home, the boxes from the food delivery service still arrived punctually, but they were opened with less enthusiasm than before. Emily tried for a while to compensate, adding fresh herbs to the soups, arranging the main dishes on her grandmother's plates, even lighting a candle at dinner, just as Lynette had once done. Yet the meals felt thin, as if the flavor had evaporated somewhere in transit. One Saturday, Emily called her brother. I think the kids miss Mom's food, she admitted, her voice low. They asked if she'd make that strawberry jam again, or maybe her poppy seed cake. I told them Grandma was busy now. Isn't that odd? I never thought I'd say that. Dan was quiet. He remembered, too, graduation dinners with steaming pot pies, the summer his wife had fallen ill and Lynette had arrived every evening with soup, bread, and quiet reassurance. He realized with a pang that he hadn't tasted his mother's cooking since February. The feeling grew until it turned to longing, a longing that surprised them both with its sharpness. On Mother's Day, Emily and Dan visited Lynette together, bringing a bouquet of tulips and a card the grandchildren had decorated with glitter and glue. They expected to find her at home, bustling over a roast, perhaps baking something special in anticipation of their visit. Instead, Lynette greeted them at the door with a gentle smile and the faint scent of vanilla on her sweater. She invited them in, offered tea, and set a plate of crisp ginger snaps on the table. They were good, But Emily tasted disappointment, sharp and immediate. She looked at the bare kitchen counter, the absence of pies or casseroles, and finally spoke, trying for a lightness she did not feel. Mom, did you bake anything for us? The kids were hoping for your lemon cake. Lynette stirred her tea and smiled softly. Not today, honey. I was up early at the library, running the club. We made bread and cinnamon rolls, and I promised I'd bring some to the folks at the shelter. But help yourself to the ginger snaps. I made those last night for a neighbor's birthday. Dan tried to keep his voice casual. Do you think maybe next week you could make that pie? The one you brought to my graduation party? I, I keep thinking about it. Lynette folded her hands and looked at her grown children, seeing not the small children they once were, but adults searching for something they could not name. She loved them fiercely, but she also saw, at last, the quiet truth. Her care could not be summoned only by habit, by expectation, by the hunger of others. It had to be met with respect, with real presence. She answered gently, He'll be at the library on Thursday. You should come, but now it's out of respect, not habit. The words settled into the quiet like the final notes of a hymn. Emily blinked, surprised by the firmness in her mother's voice, and realized it was not a rebuke, but an invitation to step into Lynette's world, to meet her not as someone to take for granted, but as a person with her own life, her own rhythms. Dan nodded slowly. Maybe we will, Mom. Maybe we will. That evening, as Lynette tidied her kitchen, she found herself humming. She was not untouched by nostalgia, the ache for her children's laughter at her table, the pride of making something just for them, but it no longer commanded her days. She felt her love expanding, not diminishing, growing beyond the walls of her house. Later that week, on Thursday, Lynette set out early for the library, carrying 2 pies in her woven basket. The club had grown again. There were new faces, young and old, quiet and boisterous. She rolled out dough alongside Daisy, helped Martha sift flour, listened as stories blossomed like wildflowers around the long wooden table. As she placed the finished pies on the center of the table, she glanced toward the door, half expecting, half hoping. Would Emily or Dan come? Would they enter not as children in need, but as people ready to see her, truly see her, for who she was now? Whatever the answer, Lynette felt no emptiness, only anticipation. The warmth in the room was real and earned. If her family came, she would welcome them. If they stayed away, she would wish them well and serve the pie just the same. And so, in the gentle clatter of bowls and laughter, Lynette found peace, her place in the world remade by choice, not obligation, by shared creation, not silent expectation. The pie was golden, fragrant, steaming, waiting for whoever came, offered in kindness, never in silence again. The library was alive with sound, a mosaic of laughter, voices, and the warm clatter of teacups. Thursday had become Lynette's favorite day, no longer because she expected anything from it, but because it unfolded each week as a small, familiar miracle. Her world was different now, full of new faces and unexpected joys. On this particular Thursday, the late afternoon sunlight spilled across the long table in the library's community room, bathing everything in a gentle golden haze. Lynette moved around the table with a calm certainty, checking on pies cooling on wire racks, straightening napkins, listening to snippets of conversation that braided together like a quilt, snatches of family stories, recipes remembered from distant kitchens, gentle teasing about lopsided biscuits and overfilled jam tarts. Her hands, so long accustomed to working alone, now reached naturally for others, offering a rolling pin to Martha, folding dough with Daisy, passing a spoon to an older man who was learning to make shortbread for the first time. Each gesture felt light, almost effortless. In these moments, Lynette was not anyone's kitchen, not the engine behind invisible, unthanked labor. She was a participant, a companion, an honored keeper of tradition and new beginnings. The air in the room was fragrant with cinnamon and baked apples, warm bread, the tang of ginger. People lingered long after the baking was done, exchanging more than food. There was the comfort of being seen, the solace of shared silence when words failed, the subtle joy of being wanted for oneself. On this day, Lynette's pie, a deep dish apple dotted with cranberries and a hint of orange zest, rested at the center of the table, glowing slightly in the sunlight. Around it, plates began to fill. A few people cut tiny slivers first, but quickly returned for seconds. A hush fell as each person took a bite, and then, as always, voices rose with exclamations of pleasure. "It's just like my grandmother's," said one woman, eyes shining. "It's better than anything at the bakery," said another. Daisy, with a shy smile, leaned against Lynette's shoulder and whispered, "I want to bake pies with you forever." And then, in the midst of all this warmth, the door opened. Emily stood in the doorway, hesitant but hopeful, her hands empty. She scanned the room, her gaze lingering on the clusters of people, the laughter, the easy togetherness, and finally found her mother. For a moment, Lynette saw her as she had been, a little girl reaching for a slice of pie, face sticky with jam, a mixture of mischief and longing in her eyes. Emily crossed the room, her movements slow, uncertain. She paused beside her mother, took in the sight of the golden pie, the joyful gathering, the way her mother's eyes shone. "I didn't know it would be like this," Emily said quietly, almost to herself. Lynette smiled, reaching for her daughter's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "It took me a long time to learn, too." For a while, Emily simply watched her mother teach Daisy how to flute a pie crust, listened to stories about kitchens filled with voices, smelled the mingling perfumes of flour and fruit and effort and love. She felt the old ache of longing, but it was mixed now with something else: respect, admiration, a kind of awe for this woman who had once seemed only to serve and who now stood at the heart of something alive and growing. As evening drew in and people began to gather their things, there was a ritual: leftovers parceled out, recipes scribbled on index cards, hugs exchanged. A few people lingered, reluctant to leave the glow behind. Lynette busied herself at the sink, humming an old tune. Finally, when the room was nearly empty, one of the new members, an older man named Arthur, paused at the door and said, "You know, Lynette, it's like you're baking us together, too. Not just the food, but all of us." Lynette, startled by the truth of it, felt her eyes sting. She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "Thank you," she said at last, voice unsteady but sure. As she walked home that evening, Lynette felt a gentle peace settle around her, softer than regret, deeper than nostalgia. The silence in her house, once sharp and aching, now felt like a warm blanket after a long day, a space waiting not for what was lost, but for what might yet arrive. In the quiet of her kitchen, she poured herself a cup of tea, set out a small plate, and sliced a piece of the leftover pie. She sat at her table as the day faded, savoring the familiar flavors: the tender crust, the sweet tart fruit, the undertone of orange and spice. Each bite was layered with memory, but also with hope, with pride, with the knowledge that her hands, her love, her voice would carry on in ways she could not have imagined. They had wanted silence, perhaps, but in letting go of being only what others needed, Lynette had found her own song, a quiet anthem of care, creativity, and chosen company. And so she ate, the kitchen dim and safe around her, the day ending not with absence, but with a fullness that needed no witness, only the gentle hush that comes when everything has, at last, found its place.